Hi everybody, TipTop Languages welcomes you to its new video channel. TipTop Languages presents interesting and relevant aspects of learning languages. My name is Hanno and today I'm going to talk about my early years of living in the divided city of Berlin in times of the Berlin Wall. I grew up here in Charlottenburg, which is in the former western part of Berlin. Later on, I moved here to the north, went to school there, and then I lived in different parts of Berlin, for example, here and there, in this part of the city, about just only 10 minutes away from the Berlin Wall. And of course, you must know that Berlin, West Berlin, was actually surrounded by the Berlin Wall all the way around. The western part of Berlin was the famous Berlin Wall, which meant that to the western part of Berlin, we were surrounded by Eastern Germany. To the eastern part, we had the eastern part of Berlin, which was then illegally sort of declared the capital of East Germany. That was our reality. As I just mentioned, I grew up about 5 kilometers away from the Berlin Wall, and it wasn't really present in our mindset. Of course, even people that were living right next to the wall, just sort of got used to it. Very much like the wall in Belfast. Human beings have an amazing capacity of getting used to really weird and bizarre circumstances of life. That was just our normality, our reality, our everyday reality. And in this way, life in Berlin wasn't really that different to life in any other city. We had our normal life here in the western part, the same way in the eastern part. People had their friends, their work life. So that was just in a certain way our normality of life. And of course, we couldn't do anything about it. These were just given political facts that you just couldn't do anything about. I want to explain a bit more about the political divisions of Germany in those times, very much imposed on the Allies that basically split up Germany like a cake in different parts of where they were basically that were under their control. So Berlin was very much divided this way. The northwestern part was the French sector, the central western part was the British sector, and the southwestern part was the American sector, whereas the whole eastern part was, of course, the Soviet sector. With a wall around, as I have already explained, the western part of Berlin. Germany, Western Germany was divided in a very similar way. I'll show this on a map. So you have to imagine the northern part of Germany was basically the northwestern part, the British zone. Right next to the French border in the southwestern part, that was given to the French. The whole southern part was actually American, and the eastern part, so basically all this line along here, was the Russian part, and of course here Berlin, basically like an island in the middle, where all the different Allied forces had an interest of being present, for being the former capital of Germany. That was very much this reality in those times until the crumbling of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I'd like to explain a bit more how it came about that the Berlin Wall was actually built up then in 1961 on the 12th of August in 1961. Basically, from one night to another, the Berlin Wall was built up. It took a few days to build and was basically so safe from the possibility of fleeing within a very short time that people were really risking their lives from the first moment on, and even before. So, first of all, a bit more about the historical facts. When Germany was divided in the different parts given to the different allies, the economic conditions in Germany developed very much this way, that the former western part that turned into a bizone, trizone, then basically among the different allied forces, Western allied forces, there was obviously a strategical interest in integrating the western part into the capitalist world and the military blocs. Making it part of Western Germany. In the 1950s, there was a real economic boom in the western part of Germany, whereas at the same time in the eastern part, the Soviet part got basically poorer and poorer, very much due to the fact that the Soviets were taking out reparations out of eastern Germany to the former Soviet Union. And of course, the eastern part just wasn't competitive to the capitalist part, the western part, for basically communist socialist management, country management. Resources were running short. Of course, in economic conditions, the eastern part was much worse off in those times. This led to a massive flood towards the western part of Germany. Within the 1950s, of course, there were border controls, so even in those times, people lost their lives for trying to do that, or in other circumstances. That's not that clear in many cases. But it led to such a situation that the East German government, obviously under supervision of the Soviet Union in a way, they couldn't make decisions on their own that freely either. So decided to build the Berlin Wall in Berlin to split up the western part from the eastern part, and they decided as well to build a fence along the eastern, the separation between Eastern Germany and Western Germany. In that part, the western part, it was basically a fence, a metallic fence, with basically a separation of possibly a kilometer, maybe more, of no man's land in between, and then a fence on further inside. And it was very much done the same way in Berlin. The Berlin Wall wasn't just one wall, because of course you can easily climb over the wall and then you're on the other side. So it was very much done this way. Throughout the times, it was getting more and more perfect, the whole construction of the Berlin Wall, that the wall was basically two walls. No? The former eastern wall that was somehow lower, then the sort of no man's land in between, with controls and then basically what we consider the Berlin Wall that very much divided the western part from this no man's land, and then the eastern part. I'd like to illustrate this. For example, you have to imagine I was living about 10 minutes away from that street, so I know this very well. Here in Neukölln, Treptow, Neukölln on the western side, Treptow on the eastern side, the wall went along this way, along this street, Boucherstraße. So this was Neukölln, western side, this was Treptow on the eastern side. And of course, the wall was then, not from the first moment on, first it was barbed wire, but within a short time it was done this way, that on the eastern side of the wall, there was a wall erected that went then this way, and on the western side, the Berlin Wall, very much that way, as I explained before, with no man's land in between towers of control, and all these installations that were somehow impeding fleeing from the east to the west. It was a very bizarre situation with a number of really strange things to recall. For example, a few more details I'd like to explain about those times. Of course, Berlin wasn't planned as a divided city, and there were lines, underground lines, going from the western part through the city center into the western part. Two parallel lines this way. There were other lines, urban train lines, for example, one that went this way, another one that went that way. So basically the West and East German government came to an agreement that those lines could be managed, could be run by the Western transport company, but all the different stations on the eastern side were basically closed. You couldn't get on, you couldn't get off in those places, except one, which was Friedrichstraße, where you could change lines, and of course from the western lines to the other western lines, and of course the people from the eastern part could also use the eastern part of the station to take their lines. So it was a really bizarre situation. And of course, as negotiations between the two Germanys came to a point that it was allowed for Westerners to visit their family members or visit the eastern part of Berlin and Germany. So then there was a checkpoint at Friedrichstraße where people could get from the west to the east, being controlled and of course getting back in the same evening, possibly if they had permission for a few days later. So that was, of course, possible in those times. It was very much this way that the people from the east couldn't get to the west unless they were privileged members of the party, sportsmen for special competitions, possibly, and retired people that were allowed to travel to the west finally. But that was very much the reality. So if there was a border crossing in those times, then it was basically from the west to the east to return then to the western part of the city. That was very much our reality then. And of course, West Berlin, very much associated with the western part, not an official part of it, being under Allied status throughout all the time, basically the western part of Germany as well. But there were transit ways of getting to Western Germany that were crossing through Eastern Germany, and it was only allowed to keep on these the shortest possible way to take the border crossings on the western side that were basically 3 or 4 authorized border crossings in those times. So that was very much the way we were connected to the western part. The stunning images from those times of the construction of the Berlin Wall were actually taken here in the northern part of Berlin, Bernauer Straße, which was as well a very particular situation. Because the separation was basically right next to the houses that were here in Bernauer Straße, which meant that the doors were actually away towards the east, the eastern part, whereas the windows on the backside were looking out towards the west, which meant that when the Berlin Wall was erected, a number of people, very much at the last possible occasion, took the chance of getting out of their windows by ropes or whatever, sheets, towards the western side. A really bizarre, strange historical situation in those times. Yeah, that was very much our reality then, getting to a sort of normality by the time. I'd like to illustrate those times a bit more, giving an impression of the political vision of those times. For example, of course, you may have seen pictures. I'll just show these to you. The Berlin Wall, very much looking this way. This must be taken out the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. Potsdamer Platz, this way. Later on, the crumbling of the Berlin Wall, then people standing on the wall in 1989. Yeah, so I'd like to explain a bit more. We had very much a perception of the eastern part of being grey, totalitarian, not really attractive to visit. So, for example, I didn't have family members. I didn't have a reason to go there. So, possibly in my whole life, I went there 3 or 4 times, not more. But that was very much the overall impression that we had from the West. There was a sensation of street controls, of being observed very much. I've got a historical map of the western part of Berlin, basically showing the complete city in a way. And there you can see, for example, the eastern part is basically colored in grey, whereas the western part in this sort of reddish color, much more joyful in a way, which is in a way as well a bit propagandistical, you can say, trying to give an impression that the West was joyful, happy, a capitalist world, whereas the East, nothing more than a grey and dull place to be. So there was obviously an interest in fomenting this image as well. I do have another map here as well, which is from the former eastern part, which is even more interesting to look at, because here you see the Berlin Wall dividing the eastern part from the western part. And if you look at it, then you see on the western part only 2 train stations, urban train stations, a line that goes this way, major streets, avenues here, some parks, and the rest is basically white. So I have to say, if I had been from the eastern part of Berlin, then probably this would have increased my interest on how life would be like in those white places here on the western side. So that was very much our reality in those times. So I'd like to explain a bit more about historical figures, and because of course people died from crossing the Berlin Wall. There are no official figures in this way because they're basically impossible to establish. But I found one that's talking about 327 people shot basically at the inner German border. 139 trying to cross the Berlin Wall, about 100 trying to get to the west by crossing the Baltic Sea, and up to 300 by trying to cross through other Eastern Europe, Eastern Bloc states towards Western neighbors that were basically blocked the same way. No official figures, because of course it's basically impossible to establish. People died already before, but quite often the circumstances were not very clear under which these people lost their lives, possibly later on as well. It's basically impossible to establish official figures. We'd be talking with these figures about 1,000 people, this way. Not such a high number either. But anyway, a few more things I'd like to mention. First of all, the crumbling of the Berlin Wall. This context in 1989 was very much in relation to certain political events. In those times, Mikhail Gorbachev was the former Soviet leader, and he had initiated a policy of glasnost and perestroika, of opening up the country, inner changes, and there was definitely a sense of change throughout the Eastern countries. And this even led to the decision of the Hungarian government to open the border towards the west in Austria. So there was finally in 1989 already a possibility of getting to the west through this border crossing via Hungary and Austria into Germany then. But it's important to mention the following as well. When in the former eastern part, the so-called Monday demonstrations rose up in those times, the major claim of the people was very much, we are the people. So this later on turned into we are one people, very much claiming unification. It is sort of true, but this wasn't the initial claim of the people. They were very much claiming inner change and more self-determination of the people, trying to reform the East Germany very much from within. So this sometimes gets lost in this historical analysis that is very often reduced to just the wish of fleeing the country, trying to get to the West by whatever means for being a totalitarian system. That's far from being true, because of course people in the eastern part, many people were of course persecuted, but the great majority of people sort of arranged with the system. We're not all very political in this way. So people have the normal tendency of trying to arrange with the political situation. And of course there were convinced socialists as well that had built up the country that way. Of course, the people in the Eastern part could watch Western television. They also knew about the social problems, economic problems in the Western part. They knew that it wasn't everything just a paradise in West Germany. Should be part of the historical analysis in a way. When we talk about the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany. So far, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've enjoyed it, then you just give me a like, you press the bell and you subscribe to my channel. Okay, goodbye folks, see you next time.